Throughout most people's lives, the buying and selling of a home is a rare and unfamiliar event. Yet it is often the biggest financial transaction we make. This can make the mechanics of negotiating the purchase and sale of a home seem complicated and stressful. This two-part presentation will show how a successfully negotiated home sale occurs along a price or money continuum, or range. Somewhere within this range, the final sale price will be established. Exactly where within this range that happens depends on who holds the advantage, the buyer or the seller. Generally speaking, a home seller's main concern is, how much money can I expect to get for my home? At the same time, an interested buyer wants to know, just how much can I get this home for? As you will see, the answer to the seller's question depends on the buyer, and conversely, the answer to the buyer's question depends on the seller. You will also see why it is the seller who holds the advantage, if they so choose. When looking to buy a property, the buyer's continuum begins at their absolute top dollar and goes down from there. There is really no limit to how low a price they are willing to pay, only how high. After all, who wouldn't want a free home? For the seller, the opposite is true. Their continuum starts at their absolute bottom dollar and goes up from there. There is no high limit for the seller. After all, who wouldn't prefer to get more money for something than it's worth? The magic of a finalized sale can only happen somewhere between a seller's bottom dollar and an interested buyer's top dollar. Think of this overlap as the line of magic. Once this line of magic is established, the buyer and the seller have some common ground over which they can begin negotiating towards the final selling price. It also introduces two critical factors that have an effect on the length of the common ground or line of magic, namely buyer desire and seller necessity. In other words, the buyer's absolute top dollar can go even higher, while the seller's absolute bottom dollar may have to go even lower. Let's first take a look at the factors that contribute to the desire of the buyer. In the science of selling, it is well recognized that once a buyer makes an emotional connection to an item, in this case where they can envision themselves living in a certain property, desire becomes a powerful factor in the outcome of negotiations. The buyer's absolute top dollar moves up. This is the role of the professional home stager. When the seller asks, "What is the maximum I can hope to get for my home?" they must appreciate that the answer depends on what they can do to capture a buyer's desire. By taking the necessary steps, they can be assured of getting top dollar for their property. The professional home stager is a master at creating desire. The other factor contributing to the final sale price of a home is the necessity of the seller. In other words, how badly does the owner need to sell? Unfortunately for them, there is virtually nothing, at least nothing lawful, a buyer can do to influence a seller's need to sell. So the responsibility falls to the seller to avoid whatever pitfalls might place him or her in a position of desperation. Easily the most common of these pitfalls is the natural tendency of the seller to set an unrealistically high asking price. Nothing is more important to getting top dollar for a home than establishing an asking price that is strongly competitive against similar products on the market. When selling one's home, time is money. If the seller cannot be convinced to establish a realistic asking price, their home will remain on the market, rapidly losing buyer interest and ultimately resulting in a backfire effect. In other words, by the time the seller receives a serious offer, the final negotiated price will actually be lower than if negotiations had taken place much earlier in the life of the listing. The very best professional home staging efforts in the world will not save an overpriced property from a long, stressful sale. So in part one of this presentation, we have shown that there is a sort of tug of war going on between buyer desire and seller necessity that will ultimately determine where the rabbit pops out of the hat along our dollar continuum. Furthermore, if they expect to receive top dollar for their property, it is the responsibility of the seller to do all they can to create that emotional connection in a prospective buyer. Simply stated, the seller must respect that the buyers are interested not in buying someone's old home, but rather their own new home. Finally, and most importantly, we've introduced the backfire effect that so often occurs when the seller sets an unrealistically high asking price for their property. In part two of this presentation, we will tackle the issue of that first price drop and detail how home staging is an investment opportunity that no seller can afford to ignore.